just want to start by saying that it's actually 10 different prisons. And I'll mention the reasons why a number of the prisons were left out of the count of how many people were striking and things like that. So, significance. So, on December 8th, 50,000 inmates living in correctional facilities in the state of Georgia went about the daily rituals of their lives, performing tours around the prison, making contact with their family and friends on the outside, and preparing themselves for their lives once they were no longer going to be wards of the state. For nearly all the inmates in Georgia, the daily ritual includes hours spent working, laboring for companies like Microsoft, Macy's, and Target. At the end of the day, the inmates are once again locked in their cells, preparing to start the same ritual again only a few hours later. But the next morning on December 9th, tens of thousands of these prisoners from 10 different state prisons in Georgia did not emerge from their cells. Refusing to be used as slave labor, they stopped all their daily activities and went on lockdown in their cells. In sharp contrast to the popular assumptions of racial tensions in prisons, the strikers crossed all boundaries of race and nationality, and black, white, Latino, Christian, Muslim, Rastafarian inmates worked together to present their 9 demands. They presented a living wage for work, in violation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude. The Department of Corrections demands prisoners work for free. Educational opportunities. For the great majority of prisoners, the Department of Corrections denies all opportunities for education beyond the GED, despite the benefit to both prisoners and society. Decent health care. In violation of the 8th Amendment, prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments, the DOC denies adequate medical care to prisoners, charges excessive fees for most minimal care, and is responsible for extraordinary pain and suffering. They demanded an end to cruel and unusual punishments. In further violation of the 8th Amendment, the Department of Corrections is responsible for cruel prisoner punishments for minor infractions of rules. Decent living conditions. Georgia prisons are confined in overcrowded, substandard conditions with little heat in the winter and oppressive heat in the summer. Nutritional meals. Vegetables and fruit are in short supply in DOC facilities, while starches and fatty foods are plentiful. Vocational and self-improvement opportunities. The DOC has stripped its facilities of all opportunities for skills training, self-improvement, and proper exercise. Access to families. The DOC has disconnected thousands of prisoners from their families by imposing excessive telephone charges and innumerable barriers to visitation. And just parole decisions. The parole board capriciously and regularly denies parole to the majority of prisoners despite evidence of eligibility. So adhering to a strict pact to use no violence, the prisoners stayed in their cells and refused to work for more than a week, while the Department of Corrections and mainstream media reported only the most unimportant facts and lies. First, they told us that the strike wasn't happening, and not until day 12 of the action, when supporters outside of the prison went to Governor Sonny Perdue's office at the National Governors Association and pasted the list of demands onto his door, did he even acknowledge that the strike was happening. And he did so by then completely dismissing the strikers and their demands. Which is why I point out that it's actually 10 facilities, because there's debate about whether it was 6 prisons, whether it was 10 prisons. If you read a lot of media, it says 6 days that the strike happened, but the prisoners say that it happened all the way into the 21st, 22nd, 23rd. So there's a lot of debate about what happened and when. Society. So then, when it was discovered that the prisoners had worked together for months using contraband cell phones sold to them by the guards, the press had a field day, focusing not on the significance of the demands, but on the method the prisoners used to convey them, employing the most ridiculous scare tactics they could. Outlawed cell phones are thriving in prison, reads the headlines of this New York Times article. The smartphone is the most lethal weapon you can get inside a prison. A convicted killer was caught in November posting photographs on his Facebook page of drugs, knives, and alcohol. In 2009, gang members in Maryland prison were caught using their smartphones to recruit targets for robberies and even order seafood and cigars. That's directly from the article itself. But perhaps most egregious of all was the way in which the capitalist media condescendingly dealt with the strikers and the demands. Why did they say the strike was happening? Almost every news source you find will point to unconfirmed, unofficial spokesman Mike for the answer. They took the cigarettes away in August or September, and a bunch of us just got to talking, and that was a big factor. Never mind the 9 demands for basic rights that should be afforded to all people. And so while the Department of Corrections and Sonny Perdue and the media put on their show, the guards in those 10 prisons put on a show of force and retaliated so brutally that many of the strikers were left unrecognizable to their families. The heat and the hot water in the prisons was shut off during 30-degree temperatures, personal belongings were destroyed, Guard shifts were set up to wake the men hourly throughout the night, and identified organizers were beaten mercilessly. One prisoner, Terrence Dean, was so badly injured that he had to be evacuated from the prison to a hospital 130 miles away. He was secretly treated for more than 2 weeks before other inmates at Macon State Prison were able to contact and inform his family of his injuries. And for another week after their discovery, his family was denied permission to see him, know the extent of his injuries and conditions, or know who attacked him and why. Not until January 2nd did he even get to see his family. And says his sister, "He's got a long way to go. He's in a wheelchair, his speech is slurred, he seems to have partial paralysis in his arm and left leg on one side. He can't walk without help, and he is very fearful." Terrence Dean did not face death for a cigarette. So what of the 9 demands made by the striking inmates? Not surprisingly, much of the public discourse surrounding the action and the demands has been a reflection of just how successful our justice system has been in dehumanizing the individuals who ended behind bars. And I'm sure most of you can guess exactly what discourse I'm talking about. It's a prison, it's not supposed to be enjoyable. Why should we pay them for their work they took from society? Now they have to pay it back. These are criminals. If they wanted better food, they shouldn't have committed crime. And because of how popular these sentiments are, it would be remiss of me to discuss the demands made by the strikers without first addressing the issue of why we have such a prison system in the first place. Because if a look at the numbers tells us anything, it's that individuals committing crime have very little to do with the explosion of the American justice system and its capitalist bedmates. So we're going to have a quick review of history. Throughout the 1970s, there was the economy went through what was commonly referred to as stagflation, a stagnant economy that sent prices soaring through the roof. From 72 to 74 and 76 to 1980, inflation rose to a level not seen since the Great Depression. And not to be outdone, unemployment in 1975 reached a whopping 9%. For the capitalists, the principal issue of this economic slowdown was a loss in overall levels of profitability. And because under capitalism, when it rains, it doesn't just pour, but it monsoons, the deindustrialization of the 1980s resulted in massive layoffs, and unemployment reached nearly 11% in 1982. Deindustrialization was a direct result of the profitability crisis of the 1970s, as the capitalist class moved more production into areas where significantly lower wage costs were available. And with so many people starving, it should surprise no one that the need for social services soared as well, despite most of these programs facing cuts in the 1980s. It should also surprise no one that the people hardest hit by that economy were the peoples most historically oppressed. In 1982, the war on drugs began, a time when drug crime was declining. In 1983, the Correctional Corporation of America was born, the largest private for-profit prison corporation in the country, who, along with Wackenhut Corporation, controls over 76% of prisons globally. Private prisons globally. Simultaneous to this, the Contra cocaine trafficking flowed cocaine into the country, and in 1984, crack cocaine exploded onto the scene. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created significant racial disparities in the prison population because of differences in sentencing for crack and powder cocaine. As the Human Rights Watch told the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1996, it takes 100 times more powder cocaine than crack to trigger the same mandatory minimum sentence. All the while, there is a massive prison building project. And so capitalism found its answer for its crisis of profitability in its regressive economic policies. What do you do with the social dynamite left to rot in the ghetto? Create a massive incarceration program based on a racist drug campaign, and watch as the prison population doubles in less than a decade. And the disconnect between the prison population explosion and the levels of crime was palpable in the 1990s. The prison population doubled again, while the homicide rate plunged 43%, violent crime plunged 34%, and property crime plunged 29%. And the war on drugs during this time, 80% were arrests for marijuana possession without intent to sell. And some of you may be saying to yourself, okay, yes, so the prison system was set up in such a way that it ensured that the number of people incarcerated, particularly within the Black and Latino population, would increase exponentially. But what about the individuals in the jails? At the end of the day, they commit crimes and deserve or even need to be in jail. Okay, well, once again, the numbers reveal a much different story. Today, over half of federal inmates in the United States are in prison due to a drug charge. In 2000, nearly 1 in 4 people in prison in the U.S. was in prison from a drug offense, with a significant proportion of these being non-violent offenders. And of those 1 in 4 incarcerated, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession, and only 1 out of 5 for sales. According to the U.S. government's Mental Health Administration, 53% of drug users have a diagnosable mental disorder, which is something to consider in light of the fact that the U.S. Bureau of Justice says that an estimated 330,000 of the 2.2 million people in American jails and prisons are mentally ill. In Georgia, 1 in 13 are behind bars, on probation, or on parole. That's the highest rate of correctional control in the nation, and more than double the national average. But over the past decade, Georgians have witnessed an unprecedented drop in serious crime. In the since 1980, nearly 1 in 4 criminal offenses relates to a traffic violation, the vast majority of those being DUI charges, and the next most prevalent charges being theft, assault and battery, drug offenses, and fraud. And far from being a place of correction and rehabilitation, the prison is just a starting point for a life of miserable options and no prospects. So as Michelle Alexander explains, the law requires the states permanently bar individuals with drug-related felony convictions from receiving federally funded public assistance. Pregnant women, women raising young children, people in drug treatment or recovery, and people suffering from HIV or AIDS are ineligible for food assistance for the rest of their lives. On top of that, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act made individuals convicted of criminal activity ineligible for public housing, and made it so that individuals in public housing could be evicted if they allowed a convicted criminal to stay with them. So with no public assistance options for former inmates, and such a high likelihood of homelessness, it is no surprise that within 3 years of their release, 67% of former inmates are rearrested, and 52% are reincarcerated. So I say again, if the numbers tell us anything, it's that individuals committing crime have very little to do with the explosion of the American criminal justice system and its capitalist bedmates. With that history lesson done, we can fast forward to present day and connect this profit industry to our striking inmates in Georgia. In the past 30 years, our system of incarceration has become a very profitable business, and so has the financial burden put upon the families of the inmates. In 2006, Corrections Corporation of America earned $1.3 billion off the backs of its prisoners, and it's easy to see why. If you quote Linda Evans and Eve Goldberg, for private businesses, prison labor is like a pot of gold. No strikes, no union organizing, no unemployment insurance or workers' compensation to pay, no language problem as in foreign countries. Prisoners do data entry for Chevron, raise hogs, shovel manure, make circuit boards, limousines, waterbeds, and lingerie for Victoria's Secret. Honda pays inmates $2 to do the same work they would have been required to pay auto workers $20 to $30 an hour to do. But prisoners in Georgia could only be so lucky because in their state, prison labor is free. Unfortunately, living in a Georgia prison isn't so free, because the 4 15-minute phone calls allotted to prisoners a month cost the inmates $55. And if the family wants to provide an inmate funds, Georgia no longer allows families to send U.S. postal money orders. It requires family to send money through JPay, a private company that takes 10% off each transfer. The state of Georgia also offers minimal education programs, with the GED being the most you can hope for. Individuals with a record already face extreme prejudice and discrimination when it comes to employment, and providing them useful degrees is a critical step towards reintegration into society. And while a Georgia inmate is still in prison, they must hope they don't get sick or injured, because while the markup on the treatment from the privatized prison medical care is horrific enough, the fact that most prisoners cannot expect to even see a health professional until they are near death is in itself criminal. But getting sick in a Georgia prison is also a virtual guarantee, because the inmates are crowded 3 to a cell, oftentimes with no heat in the freezing winter and no way to cool themselves in a sweltering southern summer, in buildings completely infested with rats. So the striking inmates are forced into literal slave labor, pay exorbitant fees while they're in prison, risk their health and their lives on a daily basis, and then face poverty, starvation, and homelessness once they are released. Needless to say, the demands made by the strikers is not petty whining from undeserving detriments to society, as the Department of Corrections or Sonny Perdue or the capitalist media would have you believe. They are a call to all people in this country to stand up and fight for the basic rights to live with safety and dignity. And we, with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, join the inmates in their call. No more slavery. Injustice in one place is an injustice to all. Inform your family to support our cause, Lockdown for Liberty.